Well, welcome to the Unstuck Church podcast. I'm Sean, and I'm here with Amy Anderson. Amy, how are you today?
Good. I can't believe, I guess by the time this episode airs, we're going to be well into mid-November and heading into the Christmas season. And so I find myself today, just as we're going to delve into, I think this is the fourth week of our weekend quality check, just really hoping that the topics that we've covered are helping them actually strengthen their weekend service for when we're going to have lots of people who don't normally come to church checking out church in the weeks to come.
Absolutely. I can't wait to talk about that. But this question just hit me. Since we're close to Thanksgiving, I want to know a little twist on a classic question. What's your least favorite Thanksgiving food? Like the Thanksgiving food you absolutely hate. I don't want it in my house. I don't want it a part of the meal. What is it for you? Because I know what it is for me.
Well, stuffing that comes out of a bird. Like, don't even put that on my table. And honestly, second is probably the turkey itself. How about you?
We're not big turkey fans either, but this is crazy. When I was little, I can distinctly remember my grandpa loved stuffing, but with oysters added to it.
Gross.
Yeah.
That is so unnecessary.
It's disgusting. And it smelled terrible too. So I don't know if anybody that's listening right now likes stuffing with oysters. I apologize if you do, but now at my house, not even allowed in the doors.
No.
It's not going to happen.
Here's how the Andersons do Thanksgiving. We have beef tenderloin. So just like
there you go,
steaks and steaks of filet mignon for everyone.
There you go.
Yep.
I love it. Jason's a master on the smoker, so
he
that
is.
makes sense. Yeah. All right. Well, before we dive into the content today, I just want to remind everybody that's listening about the show notes and our leader conversation guide. And especially if you're brand new to the podcast, you don't want to miss the free resources that we're creating to support each week's episode. So if you'd like to get access to those, just go to theunstuckgroup.com/podcast and subscribe. All right, in this series, we are sharing some practical ways that you can up the quality of your weekend planning, preparation, and your execution. And we've covered some areas where we think churches need to kind of slow down and do a quick quality check related to the way that they prepare for first-time guests, how they plan sermon series, and how the teaching team prepares messages. So, Amy, where do you want to go today?
Yeah, well, today I want us to talk about how we're doing when it comes to evaluating the overall effectiveness of our weekends. For us churches, we do this big event 52 times a year, and we invest a lot of time and a lot of resource into each of those events. And that alone should convince us of the importance of evaluating and getting better at it all the time. And of course, I'm not saying that our weekends need to be perfect. That's impossible, right? We don't need to strive for perfection. But we should have a debrief process that helps us fix our solvable problems and a process that strengthens us going forward. I just think, Sean, when we fail to evaluate the weekend and assess its effectiveness, we can get into this rut of just running the same plays and delivering the same experience each weekend. So today, I want us to talk through some ways to evaluate our weekends. And Sean, you and I both did this at our churches, so I think it'll be fun to share a couple of ways that we approach this. And plus, we have another great interview to share with our listeners from a very strategic millennial pastor that we love dearly, and that's Jimmy McCloud from First Christian in Canton, Ohio.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Like you said, I think the core issue here that creates quality problems is the Sunday is always coming issue, because there is a service every weekend, right? And it can feel like we don't have time to pause and evaluate what's working and sometimes what's not working.
Exactly. And here's some of the tensions around evaluation that I see. First, with what you just mentioned, if we don't build a system for evaluation, we just leave all the learnings we could have benefited from this past weekend and we move on to getting ready for the next weekend. And I'm a big football fan. I am a long-suffering Minnesota Vikings fan.
Yeah. Although good to be a Vikings fan this year, right?
Yeah, it is. But you live with this, when is the floor going to fall out from under you? But I'm all in. Sure. I'm still in. But Sean, can you imagine if an NFL team never reviewed their tapes? Right? If they never watched the playback and never learned what they needed to change or apply going forward. I mean, it just would not happen. So to get better and more effective, we need that same discipline. Without a process for evaluation, I just don't believe we'll get better.
Yeah.
And then a second tension that arises is when the lead pastor doesn't build that teaching message feedback into the process. I really feel like this is
Mhm.
the thing that has to happen first, a lead pastor having a feedback process for the message. Because I think if that doesn't happen, it's going to be really difficult to create a culture of continuous improvement for our weekend services. The third tension, I think, is that a lot of churches haven't defined what the actual wins are for the weekend. So you might have an evaluation built into the process, but honestly, if the wins aren't defined, then we're just evaluating things against people's preferences. For example, we coach churches to evaluate the overall experience by this overarching win. At the end of those 60 minutes, was the overall experience an invitable experience that was engaging, compelling, and helpful? And I mean, isn't that what we want every weekend, right? That it was such an engaging, compelling, and helpful experience that not only do I want to come back, but I want to bring someone with me next time. So without clearly defined wins, we have no foundation to evaluate. Sean, is there anything that you would add to that?
Yeah. So I think sometimes we've seen that this culture of evaluation can sometimes land on one extreme or the other. Meaning it can either be hypercritical and people are walking off the stage and getting a note as they walk off the stage, here's what you did wrong. Or it can just be completely blind. There's no feedback loop. There's no suggestion of adjustments or learnings from it. And we've seen this in church staff teams. They can tend to be focused either on performance, meaning outcomes, how they did, or they can be focused more on health, how they feel, how things are going. And that there's kind of a sliding spectrum that they fall in on one side or the other. And that really impacts how they view feedback, how they view criticism, how they look at improvement, etc. But really, we've seen on church teams, it is possible to strike the right balance between being a high-performing and healthy team, what we would call, and our good friend Lance Witt calls, a high-impact team, right?
Yep. I think those are great examples. The truth is, feedback can be sensitive. And our pastors, our teachers, our artists, everyone who brings that weekend together, I have to believe they give it all each weekend. So I think how we design our feedback systems are just as important as why we do it. And so there's an art to it. So part of what needs to be built in is a process that first makes feedback normal, like we all expect it, and that we do it in a way that fits, our culture and honors our people.
That's right. Amy, as you mentioned, you and I both were leaders responsible for the weekend experience in different seasons of our past ministry life. What if we just both take some time and share how we approached evaluating the weekend?
Yeah, let's do that. There's a lot of details in designing the art of evaluation, but let me just share a couple of the core aspects from my humble opinion. As I said, first you have to build a process. So you do not want to wing evaluation. Instead, you want to bake it into the rhythms of your team. So when I was the executive director of weekend services, I would often tell people that my job was about the 3 Ps: people, product, and process. So I had to lead the people that brought the weekend service together. Those were the leaders over music, production, media, communication service, programming. I was their manager. God entrusted them into my care. So I had to lead the people. Second, I had to lead the product, oversee our weekend product. And I use that as a marketing term. But when we were a 6-location church at that time, and our multi-site model was to be one church in multiple locations, well, I had to take on the responsibility to paint a picture of what our weekend expectations were related to that experience, because we wanted to replicate it at every location. So I had to bring clarity to what is our weekend product. What do we expect out of those 60 to 65 minutes? And then lastly, and this is where I was going, I had to build the processes that ensured we delivered reliably excellent and effective experiences at our church. So you have to be a process builder. The second core aspect was that I needed to define the wins of what I expected out of every part of the weekend experience. So this answers, for example, regardless of what songs we sing, what message we teach, what elements we brought into our service, what is each component actually trying to accomplish? So here's just a couple examples from our wins. So for the music time, we would ask, did the music and singing point people to God by moving them from a connection with the team to a connection with God? Ultimately, that's what we wanted to accomplish. For the message, we would ask, did the message present God's word in an engaging, compelling, and helpful way so that everyone listening will be glad they heard it and know how to take their next step? For the announcements, we would ask, were the hosted spots and announcements used effectively to communicate what is most important? So having those anchors gave us something that the question we were actually answering as we provided the feedback. We did it through that lens.
That's good. Yeah.
And then the third one goes back to what I mentioned earlier, but the lead pastor really, for us, he needed to model a culture of feedback. If he didn't do that, the rest of us weren't going to follow. And I think part of our success at our church was building a culture of feedback because of what our lead pastor and teaching team model. And here's what they did, just to put some practicality to it. Every Monday afternoon, our lead pastor pulled together a team of pastors and creative people, myself included, and he would just share what he had written so far, as well as share the direction of where he was going with his message. He'd then take pages of notes around the ideas that we all shared back to him, and he would leave that meeting with pages of ideas, quotes, and insights that otherwise probably would not have been on his radar. Proverbs 15:22, plans go wrong for a lack of advice. Many counselors bring success. So he modeled that humility of opening up, here's where I'm at. And of course, the key is you have to pick the right trusted people on that team. But he would often say, I'd rather be embarrassed sitting in front of 4 to 5 staff people that I love and trust than in front of hundreds of people who'd be sitting in church on a Sunday. So that was the nice precursor. Then after our first service on Saturday, I would meet with him to share what I thought went really well and if there were any tweaks that I thought he needed to make for the next 3 services. And I just had to say, Sean, by opening up his teaching for feedback, it really set the table to evaluate openly in other areas.
Yeah.
And so just one more, building off that. The fourth thing we did to create a culture of feedback was that we just made it normal and expected. And this can be done in a lot of ways, of course, but here's how we did it. So after the first service, I would gather the leads around the music, the production, and the service host. And I always started by sharing where things went right, because I'm a firm believer that what gets noticed gets repeated. So when our team did a great job, I just called out what they specifically did right. Not just like good job, but specific feedback. For instance, to my lighting engineer, I'd say, Jim, your lighting design was so effective. It brought focus to the places where we wanted focus, because that was the win, right? The win for lighting was to bring focus where we want focus. It was not a win if everyone just noticed the lighting, because the lighting was not where we wanted people. And so after we got through that affirmation section, then if something went wrong, I would ask, what happened? Why did it happen? Who's responsible? And how do we prevent it from happening again? So all 4 questions are important. Let me give you an example. So this is one that I know most lead pastors get annoyed by: when the slides during the worship or teaching do not move correctly. Okay, that's a common one.
Yeah.
So when that happened, I would say, all right, what happened? The slides didn't move appropriately. Why did it happen? And someone will say, well, that was the first time that he was on, CG for us. Who's responsible? This is the sticky one, right? It can be nervous if we don't have a culture feedback, but who's responsible? In that case, it was Richie, our tech director, said, that's on me. I think I put her up before she was ready. And we said, well, how do we prevent it from happening again? And that's a key question to, we don't always have the answer in that moment, but that's part of the outcome of a debrief, is going, how are we going to improve our process going forward? So part of the process was just building in that evaluation, and that helped us attain our weekend experience wins. And that helped us get incrementally better from week to week.
That's really good. And Amy, I just want to say too, I love what your example with Richie there. Just kind of calling him out, and him the willingness to own the responsibility of that, I think, is so key. Because I think many times if we don't have this culture of evaluation and feedback, there's a hesitancy to do that because that means me and sometimes my job. But just the willingness to say, "Oh yeah, that was me. I own that, and I'll fix it and make it better." I love that. I just want to share a couple. Our process was so similar to yours, but just a couple other things from what we did at my church that might be helpful. I mentioned last week that we focused a lot more on the pre-brief rather than the debrief. So talking about things ahead of time, like you did in your process. And we really wanted to catch 90% of those issues before the service happened and really lessen the need for the debrief time afterwards. And that doesn't mean we didn't debrief. There was just a lot less of those, well, how did that happen
Right.
questions and those conversations. We were focused more on those kind of good to great moves at that point after the first service. So for us, we met as a creative team each week to go over our plan for that coming weekend, as well as looking out to the next weekend. So we were kind of managing 2 weekends at a time as we were focused on execution. And each part of that weekend had an owner. Everything that we did, somebody was responsible for that. And that way we could look to, as evaluation happened, as changes happened, who owned it. And I would say this is true even for the roles that you and I were in. And we've seen and worked with many churches, even larger churches, who don't have someone who is focused just on leading the weekend. They are responsible for all the things that are happening in the weekend, a creative director or pastor. That's a critical role as your church grows. And so if you don't have that, you maybe need to be looking at restructuring in order to include that. But each part of the weekend had an owner. And we would leave that meeting with a clear sense of what we needed to do. So every week, and we would do this on Wednesday, we met as a creative team, walked out together. Here, we know what we need to do to prepare for the execution of the weekend. And we would prepare all of those elements and then do a full run through. We had some Saturday services at our church each Saturday before the service ever started. And, for us, we just realized, and it was very important to us, there wasn't an opportunity for kind of working it out during the first service of the weekend. As we got to that very first service, I did not want anyone saying, oh yeah, we messed up. Well, that was just the first service. Because that first service was probably someone's first time, right? And we didn't get a second opportunity for a first impression with them. So that pre-brief experience was really important for us so that we were prepared and ready to give our best to those people who was their very first time at the first service of the weekend.
And Sean, I want to piggyback on something you said about having a leader over the weekend experience. I think somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000, if you can get that leader in place that is primarily an off-platform leader, what this does for the lead pastor is sans that person, who's overseeing all the weekend quality? It's the lead pastor. He or she is the one who is noticing everything that's a little amiss with the weekend. And then that distracts them. And now they can't go focus on what they need to be working on. So somewhere in that 1,500 to 2,000, that's the leader that can now be the person who's carrying that load, understands the vision for the weekend that the lead pastor is trying to create, and becoming the coach and the person who buffers that feedback. Going forward, it's a lot easier to get feedback from a leader like that than, let's say, when a lead pastor has to say something to someone on or behind the scenes on that team. So,
yeah, completely agree with that, Amy. Well, before we move on, I want to take a moment and thank this week's podcast sponsor. With Plain Joe, a Storyland studio, you can unleash the power of your church's story. Their creative, fun-loving team of designers, architects, and specialists come alongside your church to help you excel in your storytelling and to reach the people who need you the most. Plain Joe has expertise in strategic, spatial, and digital storytelling, from brand development to architecture, website design, and beyond. You can learn more about their services and their team at plainjoe.net.
Well, in each episode of this series, we invited a pastor we know who leads a church excelling in a particular area of the weekend to share some insights. In this episode, we invited Jimmy McCloud from First Christian in Canton, Ohio. So, Sean, can you share a little bit about your interview?
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun to get to talk with Jimmy again. So Jimmy, we worked with Jimmy's church just a couple of years ago. Great church. They're growing like crazy. So many good things happening. Jimmy actually is on our advisory team now here at the Unstuck Group as well. But you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, he's a millennial leader, so he's on the younger side. But I actually had a chance to do the health assessment at their church. This is, again, I mentioned a couple of years ago. Had a great experience. But it wasn't a perfect experience, and I think Jimmy would say that. And there were some things in the evaluation afterwards that they continue to work on. And so I just think my experience with Jimmy, the overall great experience at First Christian, he was the right person to talk to as we think through evaluating the weekend service. So here's my interview with Jimmy McCloud. Well, Jimmy, we're in a series to encourage pastors to just kind of check the quality of their weekend services and assess if they need to kind of raise the bar. And that necessarily involves taking time to evaluate the effectiveness of what you're doing right now. So I'm just curious, how do you approach evaluating your services each week at your church?
Well, Sean, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's truly an honor to get to share with your audience a little bit of what we do at FCC. Um, for us, you said it; it's every week. The key for us has been regularity. When we really drilled down and focused on being consistent with our time to meet, that made a huge difference. And we have expectations that people do their homework before the meeting and come with notes prepared to talk about the service and really do some very intentional evaluation. So for us, that means we have a pretty clear framework for why we do what we do and how we evaluate it. We have a stated purpose for our weekend services. And for us, that purpose is to communicate one clear truth about who God is and who we are that's going to lead to transformation. So that's really what we're evaluating against. We have some core values that play a factor in this. And for us, there are three. We value excellence in everything that we do. We value intentionality in everything that we do. So we're looking for alignment in every facet of the service. We want everything to align with the content really intentionally. And we value a clear next step. We don't ever want to leave anybody wondering what to do with what they've heard. So knowing that we have a purpose and values, and we review those things every week in our meeting, the final piece of our framework is we have a target demo. So we're all on the same page as far as who we're designing a service for. And we evaluate through that filter. So we put the right voices in the room. It's anybody who has a key role in our weekend. It's our communicators. It's the people who are planning the services. It's the people who are executing the services. We've got about 5 people who play a role in that key evaluation meeting every week right now. And we've got some questions that we've mapped out ahead of time that we ask. We want to know what went well, what didn't go well. Were there any avoidable distractions, anything we could have eliminated that might have taken people's focus off of where we were trying to lead them? We want to know if there's any sideways energy. We want to know if we presented a clear next step. And sometimes I think we're really good at that. Sometimes we should have done better. And then we always outline some takeaways that we're going to convert to action, both short term, what needs to be fixed before next Sunday, and then long term things. What do we need to do to raise the bar?
Jimmy, what I've found is evaluating effectiveness seems to come more naturally for maybe marketplace businesses, but we rarely actually see it as a big part of the church culture. And in most churches, it obviously is in your church. Or sometimes on the other extreme, we find that churches take evaluation overboard. Maybe they do too much of it, or there's too much feedback. How do you guys just kind of strike the right balance, find the balance between those two things? And how do you build that into the culture of your team?
That's been a big challenge. I know that I struggle with perfectionism, so I'm always evaluating through against a really high bar. And the book Herding Tigers, reading that book a few years ago really helped me understand how to lead our creatives in a better way. So what we've tried to do is just state really clearly, again, that the purpose and the values are critical, but I've tried to establish a clear understanding of what excellence means. It's easy to look at what other churches are doing and what we would say maybe we aspire to do at some point and evaluate against that bar. But that's the fastest way to burn out creatives. And I don't want to do that to our team. And so when we talk about excellence for us, that just means doing the best you can with what you have. We try to set a clear bar for what we know we can do. And if on a scale of 1 to 10, we feel like we can bring a 6, but we brought a 4 on a Sunday, that wasn't excellent. We want to do the best we can with what we have. And then we have measured results we're looking for. We know what we want to achieve. For us, typically the next step is we want to point people towards small groups. And so it's easy to evaluate. Did anybody join a small group after our services? Did anybody, we have links with that we're able to track and pay attention to who's taking the steps we want them to take. So
that's good.
We know what we want to see on the back end of a service that we're able to evaluate against. It gives us more than maybe subjective things. We're looking for really tangible results.
Yeah, that's so good. And you mentioned next steps earlier, and this is one step that I see churches miss oftentimes is how they can use the weekend services, which are still our primary gathering point for most people in our church, right? To really drive people to next steps, to grow in their discipleship,
Mm-hmm.
to engage with the church, no matter where they're at in their own personal journey, that we can leverage that weekend to help them take a step forward. So I'd love to hear the intentionality that you have at FCC or behind that. It's very good. I just wonder for you guys right now, are there any areas of the weekend that you're specifically focused on raising the bar in terms of quality, just currently and where you're at as a church?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, we're always trying to do a better job of creating alignment between the teaching content and all of the other aspects of the service. So
Yeah.
that's something that just is evergreen. We never really feel like we've fully achieved perfection there. So we're always
Mm-hmm.
looking to do a better job with that. But aside from that, we're trying to be more intentional about presenting those clear next steps every week. Again,
Yeah.
some weeks I feel like we knocked that out of the park. Other weeks I know we could have done a better job. And so we're putting a lot of focus into that, really trying to remove any distractions or sideways energy that exist. And then for us right
Mm-hmm.
now in this season, the biggest thing is we're preparing to go from being a single location church to a multi-site church. And so
Yeah.
we're spending a lot of time evaluating hypothetically as if we had multiple locations to ask, would this have worked in a different location? Because as we're preparing for that, sort of the mantra that we use is we want our other locations maybe to be smaller, but not lesser in terms of the
Mm-hmm.
experience. And so, we're even hypothetically, we're pretending, okay, that location exists. How would this have looked in a
Yeah.
room, maybe a third the size of what we have
Yeah.
now, or with different kind of gear? So we're trying to put ourselves in that frame of mind and prepare for multiple locations.
Well, I love Jimmy. I love his church. And he's just so insightful. I'm curious, Sean, what stood out to you from that conversation?
Yeah. So I thought the simplicity of meeting to evaluate with a regular rhythm was pretty insightful. Amy, you talked about this earlier in what you did with your church, but ministry can get pretty busy and you can easily get distracted by so many other things to do. So having that regular rhythm means it's a lot more likely that you're going to have effective evaluation. It also makes those hard conversations easier. There's not much that causes your anxiety to kind of skyrocket when somebody calls you in for a meeting that's not normal. Hey, I need you to come into my office. You immediately wonder what's wrong, right? So when you do need to have those tough conversations in evaluation, having a regular meeting schedule will make that conversation go easier. I also love that they had a clear stated purpose for the weekend, and it was to communicate one clear truth about who God is and who we are. And that's so simple, but so important. They know they have insiders and outsiders in their gatherings each weekend. And they're not trying to over communicate and overwhelm people. They're just focused on one clear truth. Lastly, I'll just say that I love how they have a clear next step as well that they're pointing people to each week.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, it's small groups. And the great thing about it, and this is where the evaluation comes in, is that they can measure, did anyone join a small group?
Mm-hmm.
And that really gives them a sense of, did we accomplish what we set out to do today? And they incorporate that into their evaluation. If no one joined a small group that week, then they know it's a miss and they can really dig into kind of further into why that happened. So, Amy, I'm really enjoying this series. We've got one more week left of it. But before we wrap up today's conversation, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, this whole area of assessing the weekend service has been a part of our process since the inception of the Unstuck group. And both you and I have spent time secret shopping different services. And the past few months, we have shifted our process a little bit to shift from us doing a secret shopper to actually training and equipping church leaders to do a secret shopper at their church themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That way, it's not just someone from the outside coming in, but it's training our people to look at the weekend through a clearer filter of what it is we're trying to accomplish. So we always believe assessment comes before planning. Before we know what we need to do next, we need to pause and understand where we're healthy and where we're not. And hopefully this series, by the way, is giving you all a chance to step back and assess, how are we really doing in our weekend service? Maybe you're a church that's gotten in a rut of just running the same plays or haven't had an evaluation process. So anyways, we always do assessment before we plan. And so we're actually, for all of our subscribers, we're going to give you kind of a light version of the tool as a digital download in this series.
Mm-hmm.
And man, whether you ever hire us to help you or not, we hope that you'll use it to check the quality of your weekend.
That's right. And it'll help you with that continuous evaluation, right? To develop a system and a rhythm for doing that. Well, we'll be back next weekend with one final episode of this series on doing a weekend quality check. And we're actually going to talk about evaluating the quality of your online service and just the crucial role it plays in helping people decide to ever show up to your church in the first place. So, Amy, as we wrap up, I just want to say thanks again to everyone who tunes in weekly to these conversations. Until we're back next week, have a great week.